justice for the working man. And nothing comes for free to us working men. So much corruption from the wicked man. Cause there's no jobs out there for us working men. I bet.
This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek in Pacifica. And the issue of economics and the causes of the recent election in the United States, with inflation being a major issue, is one of the questions we're going to be addressing, as well as the crisis of capitalism and the world economy. And joining us today is Michael Roberts. He is a Marxist economist, has been writing for decades on capitalism, the economy, and the nature of the crisis. So welcome to our show, Michael.
Thank you, Steve. It's a frightening thought, decades, I think, yes. Our listeners and viewers will be realize that it's a pretty ancient Michael Roberts that they're listening to at the moment.
Well, you have that history, which is important, because if you don't know from history, if you can't learn from history, you don't know what you face in the future. So that is absolutely critical. So this recent election, one of the key issues was inflation and the effect of inflation on the working class in the United States, leading to the re-election of Trump. And of course, the Democrats and Biden saying that the things were getting better inflation-wise. And first of all, what is the situation of inflation in the United States? The Democrats have argued that things are getting better, but the working class is faced with a dire situation of food and other necessities which have risen in the cost.
Well, the first thing to say about that is that your listeners will know, because they can experience it. It's one thing to say, oh, we read from the economists and the official stats, oh, inflation's come right down. It's down to 2 or 3% a year now. So no more problems. But of course, what has happened over the last 2 years or so is a massive increase in prices across the board, but particularly in areas where the average household will see the effect on the buying for food and basic necessities in the stores and in the malls, but also the increase in the cost of the insurance, of the interest on their credit cards, and all the utilities that are involved, all have gone up pretty hugely, as we know, over the last 2 years. On average, the official rise in prices over the last 2 years or so is about 22% in the US, which, by the way, in Europe is broadly the same. In the UK, for example, it's almost exactly the same. And that's the average rise in prices, which is not going back down again. We have low inflation. All that means is we're no longer having prices rising at 8 or 10% a year. Now they're rising at 2 or 3% a year, possibly a little higher in the next few years if the policies of the new administration are applied properly. But we've had a big increase in the level of prices, and people are struggling to cope with that. And particularly for the poorer income households, where basic foodstuffs have risen more. The increase in food prices over the last 2 or 3 years is bigger than 22%. It's more like 24 or even more higher. And all those other utilities and insurances which people have also increased significantly over that period. So it is a real hit to the standards of living for the average American household, and it hasn't been compensated for sufficiently by increases in wages and earnings for the majority of households across America until very recently. Only just now we're beginning to see, with the inflation rate down to about 3% or so, that wages are getting above that. But you've lost 2 years of incomes in many ways. People are down 5, 6, 10% on their incomes compared to where they were just after the pandemic. So it's no wonder that there has been no enthusiasm for voting for the incumbent administration of the Democrats, especially when they start claiming everything is so fantastic. One of the claims they made was America's growing faster than the rest of the major economies in Europe. Well, I don't think that has much traction with the ordinary American household to know that it's even worse in Europe, which I have to tell you it is. So that's not much of an argument to expect to vote for. And that's why I think the Democrats have lost that 10 million votes that they had when Biden was elected in 2020. because Trump's vote's about the same as last time, but the Democrats have lost 10 million votes, plus people who just didn't bother to vote. You know, the working class people, unfortunately, large numbers of them don't bother to register or even vote, something like 30 to 40% every time we have a presidential election, even more when we have a congressional one.
And of course, you don't have a working class political alternative in the United States. You have two capitalist parties. They spent $12 billion on this election, and the working class obviously did not see a real political alternative. Now, the Democrats have said that one of the promises of Harris that she would control inflation and go after corporations who are raising their prices. And of course, we know that packages have gotten smaller and smaller, but the price stays the same or increases. So for the working class, it seems like the capitalists are in charge, and they've increased their profits during this past period. And can you talk about that and inflation? What causes inflation, and what can the working class to deal with inflation?
Well, one of the things we've noticed over this 2.5-year inflationary spike, which not just in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere, one of the features, what has been the biggest proportion of the increase in that price, say of 25% over the last 2 years? It's been in corporate profits. Corporate profits have contributed something like 60% of that increase in price. The other 30% is coming from increases in energy prices that we have to import from abroad, or food and so on. So sort of raw materials and things that were consumed both in factories and offices, but also at home. That's the other 30%. So only 10% has been due to any wage increases, although we are always told by the officials, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the government, or in the case of where I am, the Bank of England particularly tells us that the problem is that workers have been asking for too much wages, because it's absolute nonsense. What's happened is the big corporations in particular have hiked up their prices to take advantage of this situation and increase their profits dramatically. So when Kamala Harris said she wanted to put some sort of controls on what she called price gouging, that's companies taking unfair increases. Apparently there are fair increases, but unfair ones, she wanted to control us. That was a bit like saying that that's after the horse has bolted, that she wants to close the doors. It's too late. We have 25% increase in inflation and huge rises in corporate profits, and then she says, if I'm elected, I'm going to do something about it. Well, yeah, all she would do is sustain the high level of prices that you already got. So it wasn't a very convincing program to present. So what we've had is a profit-led inflationary spiral, not a wage-led one. And that's worth saying at this point, Steve, because this is what I know, that the mainstream economic argument for inflation is twofold. There are two reasons for inflation, according to the mainstream and the conventional economics. One is that too much money is pumped into the economy. So there's too much money supply. The banks have got the interest rates, the central bank or the Federal Reserve got the interest rate too low, or they're printing too much money. And because there's not enough goods being produced to match it, then you get inflation. That's one argument, although we've had a big rise in money supply over the last 10 years. And until we got to the pandemic, there was hardly any inflation at all. All that money did was go into the financial sector, hoarded by the banks or spent on speculation on the stock market and the bond market. So it didn't end up, it was a great boom for the very well off who invest, the 90%, the 9% of people in the US who actually have investments worth what bothering about. But for the 90% of other households, it had no effect. Then we had the inflationary spiral afterwards. Now, the other reason for inflation, we're told, is because workers ask for too much wages and they force prices up because the companies have to raise their prices to compensate for increased wages to maintain their profits. Well, there's no necessary reason why they should maintain their profits. It's only we have a system where you have to maintain your profits if anything gets done in the countries like America. We have a capitalist system, so that's the way it works. Those two arguments actually have borne no empirical validity over the last 30 or 40 years. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, and in the 1970s, we had sharp price rises as well, but we also had increased unemployment and not any wage increases at all. We had the opposite of what was argued in that case, no wage increases, and we still had inflation. So there's what was called stagflation in those days, no growth, but inflation. And that disproved the idea that it's wage increases that cause price rises. So what does cause inflation? Well, I think there are two things here. It's perhaps a more complicated thing to discuss, but I would say if I try to put it simply, is to say that if an economy is not growing very fast, if it's struggling to grow, if it's not expanding sufficiently to provide all the things that social things that and supply that people need, and if people have money in their pockets, particularly after the pandemic, when there were many people locked up with put in their savings, so lots of people had to go and spend and work during COVID, but the sizable section of the households got money from the government, which they couldn't actually spend except on goods. They couldn't spend it on services, on restaurants, on flying anywhere, and so on. But as soon as that was released, then all those industries that relied on those sorts of services have been so shrunk down that they couldn't respond to this. So there's a massive rise, or the opportunity for companies to boost their prices dramatically. So it's the combination of, if you've got a poor economy that's not productively growing fast, and then you get a burst of money for whatever reason that comes into the system, then it drives up prices. And that's what we've seen over the last 2 years. What's the answer to this? Well, the answer to this, if an economy is properly, productively growing, so that there's an increase in resources across the board because there's proper investment, proper government support for investment, and that provides the opportunity for people to get better wages, then economies can grow with higher wages, which are not affected by inflation. But that's not what's happened to the majority of the major economies in Europe and in North America in the last 2.5 years.
And the issue of the United States is the deindustrialization of the United States, when large amounts of the industry were shipped out first to the South, then to Mexico, then to Asia. And now the Trump administration say that they're going to make America great again by having tariffs and forcing production back into the United States. First of all, what is that all about? Because both capitalist parties were in favor of NAFTA, were in favor of exporting capital and having a global economy where they could pit workers against workers around the world for increased profits. So this whole effort to have tariffs and the likelihood of trade war, what is that about in relationship to capitalism and capitalist inter-imperialist?
As you said, Steve, one of the big things that happened in the second half of the 20th century, from about the 1980s onwards, after the huge manufacturing slump that we had in America and Canada and Europe, if those who can remember, in the smokestack industries and in the steel belt and the coal belt in the US, the old heavy industries, that was wiped out. And what happened was that the capitalists decided that they could make much better profits if they shifted all their manufacturing and their industry over to Asia, to Latin America and so on, where they could get very cheap labor, and they could also use the latest technology. They didn't have to use the old technology. They could bring the new technology into places like China and into Brazil and so on. So the latest car factory, and with the cheapest labor, so they could make massive profits. So we had this, what was called globalization, which is a front term for saying that capitalists decided to ditch North America and Europe and shift to the poorest countries in the world, exploit them hard, and use the new latest technology. So you had this huge increase in trade, but it was, what that led to was quite a holding down of prices, because manufacturing goods consumed by people in North America and elsewhere, all our TVs and all the rest of it, suddenly were being produced abroad at a much cheaper price, and they could flood the market at low prices. So a lot of things kept prices down as a result of that. But then what we've just seen since the 21st century is that this situation actually led to a massive rise, in particular with the Chinese economic system. They have dramatically increased their manufacturing, their exports, in not just in basic goods like originally with the TVs and all the rest of it, but now into high technology goods, where they do all the usual things that Americans used to do with their smartphones, with their iPads, all that. Chinese can do that cheaper. And above all, with electric vehicles, they are smashing the world market at the moment because they've delivered them. You get a Tesla, mate, it costs you, I don't know what it costs in the States, but it's quite expensive. If the Chinese are allowed to import their Chinese EV, it's way cheaper and better. So they're really just smashing the rest of the advanced countries' manufacturing sector. Germany is in deep trouble as a result of this now. So that situation cannot be allowed to continue. That's what is frightening, not just the new Trump administration, but the old administration under Biden, where we've had a series of tariffs as well, and in Europe. So now the big battle is a complete reversal. As you say, Trump wants to friendshore, that's the phrase we use in economics. He's going to put manufacturing with our friends, not with China, and preferably actually in the US itself. And he's telling countries like Europe and Taiwan, if you go on trading with China, we're going to put the whip onto you guys, and you're going to have to change that policy. So you've got to sanction China, you've got to block their trade, you've got to stop even go further than that, to surround them as well militarily, and basically try to strangle the Chinese economy because it's damaging, as the administration sees here, in both in the UK and the US, it's damaging the future of American capitalism and British capitalism. They can't be allowed to continue any further into the 21st century. And that's the big struggle. So we're going to see a massive increase in tariffs. For listeners, what that means is you buy goods in the shops now, but they're going to slap, if it's a Chinese good, 60% more on the price of that good. Now, that means if you continue to buy it, it's really hitting you in terms of the cost to do so. And if you don't buy it, you won't be able to get it. You'll have to buy a Tesla or a much more expensive American commodity that's been produced at home because you cannot afford even to buy the Chinese one, or it's not even available anymore because it's been banned, and which applies to phones and other things. That's the battle that's now going to happen. This is going to damage the world's economy, because if we don't trade and improve and raise productivity and cooperate together internationally, then it's very difficult for the world economy as a whole to expand. And if we start applying these sorts of restrictions, it was just going to make it worse, particularly for poorer people. It's going to make it difficult for the poor people of the peripheral world in India and China and Latin America, because they'll lose their exports, their revenues, and it's going to make it much more expensive for us in North America and Europe. But that policy is one that's going to be applied because the people who run our countries, the billionaires, the industrialists, the bankers, and the politicians are desperate to do something about China.
Another aspect of this global financial crisis is the speculation and the rise of cryptocurrency and digital money as a effort to protect your currency. What is the nature of this cryptocurrency and the drive by now Trump to say that the crypto billionaires are going to be able to even make more money on crypto speculation?
Well, today I saw that the Bitcoin, which is the best known cryptocurrency, is now $90,000 per coin. And that's gone up from something like $35,000 just at the beginning of this year. It has been as low, well, it started off more or less zero, but it's up and down all over the place. It fluctuates all over the place. But now we've got record figures. So the Bitcoin speculators and the Bitcoin exchanges, half of them probably corrupt entirely. One of them was so corrupt that it lost billions to people already. They're now making hay while the sun shines under the expected Trump administration, who's not going to apply any regulations over this speculative exchange and activity. But if we ask ourselves, how did all this come from? What is this cryptocurrency thing? Where is it coming from? And what does it mean in terms of our ordinary lives? Well, way back, say 15, 20 years ago, somebody came up with the idea that you don't need paper currencies. You don't need the banks to control your currency. You don't need the Federal Reserve, and What you can do is have a digital currency, which we can operate through this computer with a bit of software between you and me. So we have a bit of software, we can make transactions using our own currency, in Bitcoin or Ether or all the others and so on. And we can do that using a formula that was invented. And we can trust that our transaction is safe by using this formula. And the currency will be created accordingly. So there'll be a bunch of people with huge computers around the world. It used to be in China, but now it's mainly in other parts of the world, who will produce the relevant amount of Bitcoin once the formula has been completed. Doesn't this sound weird? But this is what it is. The idea is to replace what we consider as money, whether it's coins, papers, or even our bank accounts held with the official banks, with a completely separate currency, and make transactions through that method rather than through the official sources. Now, a lot of people thought 15, 20 years ago, this is great. We finally got the horrible grip of the government away from us. We're free. We've been liberalized. We can do what we like as individuals and make these exchanges with trust. But of course, what happened within a very short period of time is that the big capitalist companies and speculators and crooks got into this operation. And now most of the mining, as it's called, the production of these coins, digital coins, remember, they're not real coins, digital coins, is in the hands of a very small number of companies. And the big speculators and investors in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, there are about 30 or 40 cryptocurrencies, everybody invents one every day, is in control of a very small number of investors who speculate in and out every day. Now, again, just to say, finish on this point, the digital currency was supposed to be an idea that could replace, as I say, the existing paper currencies or the official currencies, and we would use it in our daily lives, just go on the computer and do get some digital currency and buy things with it with complete trust between individuals. But of course, what has happened is nothing like that's happened because the price shoots all over the place. How can you be sure that if you're paid in Bitcoin one day at $90,000 per Bitcoin and the next day it's $10,000, there's no way you can conduct your life like that. You need some stability in the currency and the value of the currency you're getting when you get your pay packet. So at the moment, all these currencies can't be used in everyday life. They're really just another piece of speculation by the big boys down in Wall Street and God knows where across the world, just to make a quick buck. And if necessary, if things go bust, not our problem. Anyway, for the moment, Trump's going to give it a complete go-ahead. Go make some more money. Cryptocurrencies are the way forward. And as you know, he hates the Federal Reserve. So anything to give the Federal Reserve a bit of a heart attack or a problem at night is just up his street.
And the whole financial structure of the global economy is, if it's deregulated, which is what Trump and his supporters want to do, wouldn't that likely lead to a massive financial panic, even greater than 2008, where everyone gets out of this speculation at once, it will lead to a financial collapse internationally?
I think you're right. I think if we look back at the 2008 great global financial crash, if you remember, with some of the top banks going to the wall, Lehman Brothers and all those, and a lot of mortgage companies collapsing, we can see the risk that lies ahead if there's no regulation of these companies, or if, frankly, in my view, that we don't have actual public control over them. Of course we don't. I mean, why JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and the big banks should be able to do what they like without public and democratic control is beyond me, but that's the way it operates. But if there's no regulation at all, and if these people can decide whether they want to speculate in whatever they like with our money because they're taking our deposits and they're using that to make this speculation, they can bring the financial system down as it was in 2008. We know what brought that down, at least on the surface. That was the fact the economies weren't doing very well. Suddenly the people were faced with huge mortgages on houses that they could no longer pay. So we got a terrible collapse in the mortgage market because people, so-called subprime mortgages, all that was that mortgage companies were selling mortgages to people who really couldn't afford them because they can make more and more money out of that, completely deregulating the mortgage market. And that eventually led to this massive collapse, because what they did with the mortgages that they sold was that they sold them to each other. They created what they called mortgage bonds, and then they were created speculating on the price of the mortgage bond, a derivative of that, and so on. It spiraled into a complete fantasy world. And that's the risk that lies ahead. Cryptocurrency is a good example. That we're going to have more of these fantasy currencies, fantasy securities developing if there's no regulation, and that they could they could lead to a massive fallback in the financial sector, which will hit the rest of us. As long as the economy is growing a little bit, that's probably avoided. But we're told that the US economy is bounding forward, but it's growing at Steve, just 2.5% a year in output, national output. It's better than Europe, but I can assure you that's pretty slow for what's happened in the previous history of the American system.
And tariff trade wars is what we're going into now.
Yeah.
If Trump has a 10, 20, 50% tariff on goods from China, on Europe, and on Asia, other countries in Asia, wouldn't that lead to a growing economic crisis for Europe, particularly Germany, which is being crushed by the Chinese control of electrical vehicles, or the cost of them? This growing trade war with tariffs, where is that going to lead economically for the global economy?
Yes, well, I think in general, you're correct, because if we have tariffs, they're going to reduce the international trade, the growth of international trade. That means that whole sectors of economies which depend on trade, in manufacturing in particular, are going to be squeezed, and they're not going to be able to grow as fast as they can hope for if there will be an international trade. The aim, of course, of the administration and the European Union is that it's China that's going to suffer, and European Union and North America is not going to suffer. But all I can say is I was reading what Marco Rubio published today, and he's going to be the man carrying through this policy of attacking China. And he wrote a very long piece in which he said China's doing great. Well, we've got to stop it. And that's the indication, I think, of who's going to win and who's going to lose out of this if this process goes on. But certainly everybody will lose to some extent if there's tariffs. And as you say, when you get a squeeze on the economy, and then you've got financial speculation going on behind that, which is not out of control, then there's every possibility of a major collapse, not just in Europe. Germany's collapsed already. It's already there. It's not grown for 3 years, and it's in a recession. And now the government is being forced into a new election in February because they can't hold the government together anymore, given the situation. Energy prices in Germany have rocketed because they closed the gas pipelines and oil pipelines from Russia because of the Ukraine war. And they can't sell their goods into the rest of the world because China's beating them on the export side. So this is a catastrophe for German capitalism and the economy. Germany is supposed to be the powerhouse of Europe for the last 30 or 40 years. It is now in a deep, deep situation. That could apply to a lot of other countries over the next period. I say, Steve, I think this reminds me a bit like the 1930s. If you remember, we got the trade tariffs applied in the 1930s, both in various parts of the world, particularly in the major economies, to try and protect each national economy against the downturn that was taking place. That just made things worse and created the Great Depression that we had in the 1930s. So there's a serious danger that if these policies are applied effectively and by the new administration, and all the other trends that I've just described to you continue, then we could have a financial crash and a downturn in the world economy before this end of this decade.
And isn't the rise of inter-imperialist rivalries now, United States wanted Germany to shut off their gas in their trade with Russia, even though it's next to them. It weakened Germany, and yet the Social Democrats, the governments, went along with the United States to shut off all trade with Russia. Isn't this inter-imperialist rivalry at work in the global economy, where each imperialist country is trying to solve their problems by putting it on another weaker economy or another economy?
Well, what we've seen is that surprisingly, you would think, I mean, we Europeans thought, well, we are a sort of an independent capitalist area. We've got our own interests, developing industry in Eastern Europe. The Germans and the French thought that, and the Americans have got Latin America and so on, and we've got our area to develop, and we've got good relations with Russia and China, so we can use their cheap gas, and with China we can get their cheap goods and we can sell into it. That's what was happening in the 1990s and the 2000s. But the how has it transformed? The independence of Europe as a separate power from the United States has been wiped out, basically because of the Americans are saying, look, if you want to continue the war in Ukraine against the Russians, you've got to do what we say, which is drop every connection you've got with Russia, drop every connection with China, take the hit on your energy prices, and we'll keep our American troops and NATO bases in there to protect you from the inevitable Putin invasion, which will take place within the next week or so. So this line has been swallowed hook, line, and sinker by the European leaders who have decided, not asking their own public, by the way, but they've decided that it's better to do what the Americans say rather than continue to have economic prosperity, which they had been achieving to some extent in the previous 25 years. So I have to sit here aghast when I see the failure of the European capitalists to defend their own interests and put everything in the one box with Donald Trump and the administration over the next period. I don't know where this is going to leave Europe. It is a disaster for European capitalism.
Well, it also has led to the rise of fascism.
Yes.
And the blaming of immigrants for this crisis. And many of those immigrants came from Syria, from Iraq, from Libya because of U.S. wars in the Middle East, driving those migration, and then being blamed by fascist right-wingers for the cause of the economic crisis. So this is,
I mean, as you say, this inter-imperialist rivalry has become US hegemony, controlling everything. But for what purpose? The purpose is to weaken any country or defeat any country which opposes US hegemony and the control of the world. So that means Russia, that means China, and anybody else who steps out of line will face the same fate. This policy is not only, I mean, it's not going to succeed in my view, but even if it also damages the world economy and puts this position in. But what it has led to is the complete disillusionment on the part of the citizens of Europe and elsewhere with what they used to consider was good, progressive, social democratic governments that improved things for workers a bit and kept the welfare state going, even if they didn't do much more than that. And that was better than having, on the whole, conservative governments that wanted to just use capitalism to expand. So that there was obviously divisions in these countries like Germany and France between those two wings, but there was still a lot of support for what was called social democrat parties. That's collapsed. It's completely collapsed. And it's not just immigration, which is a big issue when you have millions of people coming in who have still got to fit into countries where they can't really provide the services for. And these Americans, by the way, are dramatically helping the economy because they're doing all the cheap labor and everything else and working in the health service and the education service in jobs that people don't want to do. But on the other hand, it's also creating very great difficulties, at least in the minds of a section of people. This is changing their lives, their culture, and so on. And so we get this what only could be regarded as a racist view towards strangers. It's strange. US is a country of immigrants, isn't it? It's always been a history of immigrants of various sorts from the beginning, starting with the Pilgrim Fathers, or even earlier, coming in, wiping out the indigenous population, of course, and then continuing to bring in more and more immigrants. But now immigrants is not a good idea, even though we know now that major part of the US growth in the last few years has been because of the increase in immigration, providing more output in the worst jobs. But you're right. What we've seen now is two things which have collapsed the center, the Social Democrats in particular, and two things are driving that. First, the inflation and the cost of living crisis, which you've just discussed, but also the idea of immigration, which has been brought up as the issue which is destroying the economy. Not just President Trump talks about deporting the immigrants to solve this issue, but in Britain we had a campaign over Britain leaving the European Union back in the middle of 2016 onwards, so-called Brexit, and we eventually voted narrowly, the public did, to leave the European Union. And what was one of the reasons? One of the reasons was there's all these immigrants coming from Poland and Eastern Europe destroying our economy. The ironic situation is, Steve, that since we've come out of the European Union, the UK economy has gotten such a mess that all the Poles and Eastern Europeans have gone home. They're making more money, and Poland is more prosperous than the UK is now. Such is the situation that they have done with that. But you're right. Unfortunately, this perception that somebody else who doesn't speak your language, or perhaps a different color, is your problem, and that you've got to deal with that, rather than the billionaires and the people who are running our country into the ground.
Now, one area of new investment in the United States and internationally is AI and the development of artificial intelligence. And billionaires, including Musk, want to develop AI for more profit. Let's compare, and maybe you can, the Industrial Revolution and the effect on the working class till today, because Goldman Sachs, for example, did a study, said 350 million workers could lose their jobs. In San Francisco today, you have autonomous vehicles. They want to have autonomous trucks, which would drive millions of truck drivers out of their jobs. Drivers are threatened. Yet the capitalists seem to feel that that is the solution financially to them to make great profits and getting rid of labor throughout the world economy. What is your view about comparing, for example, the development of the AI revolution with the Industrial Revolution, the effect on the working class, and how workers can deal with this development of technology?
Yeah, well, AI is the savior of capitalism. That's the cry in the financial pages. Crikey, we found some technology which can transform the picture. We can stop crawling along, and we can suddenly jump forward with huge productivity. Of course, if more output per worker at the expense of a lot of workers not having their jobs and have to consider finding some other job. Now, in the Industrial Revolution, in the early part of the 19th century, starting in the UK and elsewhere, Engels describes it well, and he wrote a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, and he explained, look, this move towards big cities, industries, smokestack industries, cotton spinning, and all the rest of it, wiping out the hand weavers and so on. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. But on the other hand, there was a dramatic increase in machinery and factory output and so on. And for a whole period, from say about 1830 to 1850, lots of workers were in dire poverty and out of work. Gradually, that transformed itself from 1850 onwards as new industries developed as a result of this mechanization, and more workers began to get jobs. So what I think that's a reasonable model. What you could say is that how capitalism works, if it's under socialism, if you decided you had a new technology and it meant a loss of jobs in that area because the machines can do it better, what you would do is you'd plan that situation, you'd introduce the machinery, and you'd retrain your workers who no longer needed that into something else. There are plenty of areas where we still need lots of workers, particularly in areas like health, education, other services, and so on, or in the environment, as we know now with the climate change. There's plenty of possibilities for employment, but capitalism doesn't work like that. The capitalist companies don't plan the whole economy so that it benefits our job situation. They just sack us all and put the machines in, and it's up to you to sort out your mess after that. And that situation applied in the middle of the 19th century, but eventually you get a change around. But as Mark said, yeah, you get a change around, and then you get some more employment. But you could be a whole generation of workers get no work at all. I mean, we talk about when we ended our mining industry in the UK back in 1990. By the 1990s, the mining industry was smashed, and miners lost all their jobs. Coal industries closed down. Now, eventually we got new industries in various other areas, but a whole generation of miners, their families and their kids didn't really get any work at all until a new generation. We don't have to have that wastage of people's lives in order to transform and use new technology. But that's the danger we have with AI. It could eventually provide new areas for growth for everybody and save time and all the rest of it, but it won't be done in a planned way. It won't be done in the interests of the population. It'll be done in the interests of Goldman Sachs. It'll be done in the interests of the owners of AI, like NVIDIA, this big company that's operating the basis of the chips and so on for AI. They're being subsidized by the administration, both Biden and will be by Trump, huge billions going in, so they can build their plants to make more money and sack everybody else. That's how AI is going to work. The only proviso, Steve, is that for the capitalists, it's going to take a long time before they see the results of this. In the previous technological revolutions have normally taken about 20 years before they diffuse through the economy. You get the idea, you get the product, and you get it going, but it takes 20 years to diffuse on average through the economy. So AI is just starting. Here we are, say 2022 or something like that. We're talking about up to 2040 before we really see the beneficial effects, at least in productivity, from AI, assuming that it works. I mean, there's still a lot of doubt about whether AI is really such a fantastic technology. What I would say when we were talking about financial crash, the money that's being speculated in AI is huge. So if this goes wrong, you will definitely have a very nasty nightmare when companies find out they've borrowed and raised all this money and it doesn't work.
And of course, AI is an international development. And in China, for example, you have factories which run with AI automation and no workers. In China, the unlimited introduction of autonomous vehicles, and that's led increasing unemployment in China as well, because you don't need as many workers. So this is a global issue of the working class. And what you're saying is the working class should really control the development and introduction of technology to benefit working people and not the billionaires like Musk and the people that are supporting both parties, the Democrats and Republicans.
What a huge increase in productivity use of machinery should mean is that we should all be working less hours in the week than in the year. It should be a reduction of hours. We all have a job, but we don't work. I mean, in a way, the COVID pandemic showed what would be possible. We could go to 2 or 3 days at home and 2 or 3 days at work, or we'd only have to work 2 or 3 days. So there's no reason why we couldn't reduce the working week as a result of the increase in productivity and let the machines do the rest. Now, that, of course, is not being proposed. I remember in 1931, John Maynard Keynes, who's a big, famous economist in Britain, said he told his students, look, don't worry, this big unemployment we've got in the 1930s will disappear, because once we've got the economies going, then we'll get a huge increase in productivity, and we can all, he said, by the time you are getting to your grandchildren around, you'll all be working a 15-hour week. Well, I have to say, I don't know what Americans are working, but they're working a good 40 hours mostly, and all sorts of shifts, no doubt, and it's pretty much the same in Europe. So nothing's really happened in the last 90 years to change their working week.
And you have the gig economy, and people are attached to their cell phone and work 2 or 3 jobs to make the same income.
Exactly.
Regular work is being destroyed. Temporary work, contract labor, and all over the world is being expanded in South Africa and Namibia, going back to contract labor. Now, this gives to the rise of the question of the techno-fascists and their view of the world, because they do have a world that they should be in charge, and it should be a different kind of structure where you don't have a constitution. They can do whatever they want. What is capitalism and fascism? What is the relationship of capitalism and fascism? Because these people have a ideological idea that we should basically free ourselves from any kind of restraint in any kind of constitution.
Yes, well, if we remember, the word fascism originally came from Italy, and it was the idea that Mussolini, who was the fascist leader and dictator in Italy from the 1920s, he saw fascism as combining the big corporations that we all know about now with his gang of thugs without a constitution. So the corporations would continue, capitalism would continue, the fascists would run the show without parliament and all the rest of it. Everybody was arrested, by the way, and disappeared into prison. Then when we get to Hitler, which is another form of fascism, basically once he won an election with a minority vote, by the way, in 1932, then there was never another election again. Once that
And Trump has promised that to the Christians, actually.
yes,
Last vote, you won't have to vote anymore.
exactly. So that there was no need for elections because the population had realized that the Third Reich was going to lead them for 1,000 years, and everything would be fine. All we had to do was to conduct a major wars against Russia in particular, but then the West as well, in order to ensure that. So we entered the horrendous position of a world war and the Holocaust for millions, not just of Jews, but also of anybody who opposed Hitler. Poles, everybody in all countries were introduced to the Holocaust as part of the process of establishing fascism. So this is what we understand mean by fascism. Now, we haven't reached that stage yet, have we? In the US, you still have a constitution, you still have an election of sorts, and you still have certain rights where you can go on the street and complain or get beaten up by the police, but you still have a certain level of ability to protest, and a certain level of democracy still exists in most of the advanced capitalist economies at the moment. These people want to change that. They don't want that to continue. They think that that's just letting lefty unrulies take over. What we need is a position where, in conjunction with the corporations, in conjunction with the armed forces, they can establish a complete direct control of the economy and people's lives without any constitution. We haven't reached that stage yet. It'll be a see how that will develop over the next 10 years or so. I mean, I don't know what you think, Steve, but I can't see the American public accepting easily the idea that 200 odd years of the American Constitution should be wiped out because apparently it's more effective not to have one. But of course, that's what people thought in 1932 as well, in the Weimar Republic, that wasn't possible to get rid of democracy. But we'll see that the forces of fascism exist. They are not strong yet. They are not decisive yet. But if they can be latched onto the forces of the military forces and the civil forces of arms, then there's a possibility of that could happen over the next 10 years, especially when we see the increased difficulty for capitalism to sustain its position and provide sufficient resources so that the working class doesn't become troublesome.
Well, if we're talking about a trade war, tariff war, if we're talking about the potential of a depression, a global depression, where millions of people are unemployed, you're talking about a condition in which people like Musk and others could fund fascist gangs.
They would have to. I think they would have to, because I can't. What we've had over the last 15 years is, rather than liquidate loads of companies and workers that are inefficient and unprofitable, they've actually subsidized them. They've sort of kept them going with cheap loans and so on, the banks and so on. These companies are called zombie companies, the living dead. So they don't actually make a profit. They don't increase employment. They don't train staff. They don't do anything. They don't invest. What they do is just tick over with more and more debt. And that's about 25% of companies in the advanced capitalist world. The reason they've been kept going is precisely because if you actually cleanse the system in the interests of capitalism, get rid of all these inefficient companies with their inefficient machines and their useless workers, get rid of them all so that we can use AI everywhere. They've been reluctant to do that because of the political consequences of rousing the working class into action. So if they may consider that over the next 10 years to do that. But as you say, in order to do that, they will probably have to resort not to winning elections, that's one thing, but to actually getting rid of elections and imposing some sort of regime. All I can say, viewers, is we're not quite there yet. So that's why it's so important for us to understand what's going to happen and do something about it before it does.
And this brings us to the issue of China, because China does have zombie companies in its economy, and also at the same time, China has become the largest exporter of capital, private and public, in the world. It's bought ports, it's bought natural resources. For example, in Namibia, it controls all the mines, the uranium mines, the marble mines. It is a major exporter of capital, and isn't that labor exploitation of China on a global level? Because their investments around the world, in many cases, they've tried to break the unions. The Piraeus, Port of Piraeus in Greece, they tried to bust the union. And in Namibia and other countries, they want a union-free environment for increased exploitation. What does this export of capital mean in relationship to global capitalism by China?
Well, Steve, I probably disagree with you here on this area because I think there are certain differences about the Chinese economy, which at least I would consider, the viewers could consider. First of all, China's been able to grow like it has and expand its manufacturing industry and develop exports and raise the living standards of Chinese people. Remember that over the last 40 years, something like 800 million Chinese have come off the level of poverty, which the World Bank calls poverty. It's still not particularly high for a lot of them, but then even so, hundreds of millions of Chinese are no longer poor or destitute. They've actually got something for themselves, unlike in India, which has not really progressed in that way at all. And that's the product of having such a large state sector where the big banks, the big industries, the major infrastructure and building areas are under the control of the state, which directs things. Now, that state is run by a communist party that doesn't allow democracy. But it does mean that it can plan the economy. Because it doesn't allow democracy, I think it makes lots of mistakes. But it nevertheless has enabled the economy to expand without having to worry about booms and slumps that we've got in the capitalist system that we've seen over the last 40 years. So that's enabled it to expand dramatically. It has also expanded abroad as a result, not so much because it's a huge export of capital. I know it's risen a lot, but if you compare it to the export of capital by North America and Europe into the rest of the world, it's still relatively small. They've started what they call a Belt and Road initiative, which is to start to build ports and so on, provide loans to countries in the so-called global south in order for them to grow. And they've, as it were, competed with the IMF and the World Bank and the Americans to do that. They've offered better deals. Sometimes those better deals don't turn out to be better, as you pointed out, but on the whole, they've started to compete in the area of foreign investment against the Americans, the World Bank, and the West. Another frightening thing for the West. They don't like this because it means the governments of Africa, the governments of many parts of Asia and Central Asia look to the Chinese for financing now, rather than to the West. And that means the Chinese gain influence to sell their products as well. And what the Chinese are after is not so much making a profit. Profitability isn't in the minds of the state-run Chinese companies. What's in their minds is getting the resources, as you pointed out, the minerals, the other resources, which they don't have in China, which they can then get transformed and transferred into the Chinese economy. In some ways, this is a good idea that it links the poor countries. They get infrastructure building, they get the other things, and the Chinese get resources. You could call that proper trade. Obviously, sometimes it's more one-sided than it seems like an equal thing. But it's not that I don't think we can consider what's happening in China's export of capital and development into foreign resources yet as anything like the level that North America and Europe has had in the past and still has. Most foreign investment still takes place between those countries rather than into the periphery. And American capital, American finance is one of their big pluses. They're still in control of the financial world. They've got the dollar. They've got all the big banks and resources. The Chinese don't have that yet, and they won't have a currency which can compete with the dollar as far as we can see ahead.
Well, China, of course, entered, as you say, the World Bank and the IMF,
Yep.
and the WTO. And in South Africa, they flooded the market with cheap garments. They destroyed the garment industry in Cape Town. 20,000 workers lost their job. it led to actually deindustrialization
Mm.
in South Africa. And China has argued that they're going to increase the wealth of the country by their investments. But most of their investments are for getting natural resources out of
Yeah.
the country, not for developing
There's
industrial.
not many jobs involved either. No.
So what that means as the country is left uh, similar to Europeans and the United States with investment to get the resources out and not an industrial development of the country, and also corruption and capture of governments
Well, yeah.
by Chinese officials. The corruption is endemic, where in Gupta, in South Africa, and in Namibia, the SWAPO, they take money from the Chinese, and they have captured the Labor Commission. They've captured government agencies which are supposed to be oversight of the environment and of labor relations. So the question is, isn't this export of capital, both public and private, not just public companies, but private companies, ending up in the destruction of the working class and the unions, and thereby harming the interests of the working class? In other words, that development of China for investment is actually not improving the conditions of the working class in Asia and in particularly in Africa.
Well, perhaps we should think of this way. If the Chinese didn't do any of this, would that improve the situation in South Africa or in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, or in Asia or in Central Asia? Would it improve if the Chinese just stayed out of it and let so what would these governments do? What would the South African government do? What would all these other? They would go to the World Bank, the IMF, to the hedge funds, to the private equity companies of the North America, and try to do deals with them to extract all the resources and so on. The point I would always say to that is, okay, you could say, oh, China's destroying the economy. But if we don't have China there, somebody else will be doing it, because the national governments of these countries are just useless. They are pro-capitalist, pro-business, pro-imperialist. What we need is radical socialist governments in Southern Africa, in Central Asia, in Latin America, which can organize together cooperatively to build their resources and use their resources for themselves on a basis of cooperative commonwealth of countries in that area. So I have to throw the question back and say, well, if you're living in those countries, you've got to be organizing to get rid of your government and replace it with a socialist one and spread it over, and not just say, oh, it's all the fault of the Chinese. This is a nice argument for the ruling class of South Africa, and I don't think we should let them get away with it.
Now, one of the developments of technology and the internet, of course, is communication technology, what we're doing now in this Zoom. But as far as the power and role of communication technology in a new world, for example, a division of labor, for example, workers of the world running the world, how is this communication technology and internet, how could it be a tool for the reorganization of the world? Because there's a possibility now of direct communication of workers to workers around the world. There's a possibility of workers linking up internationally. And if the reorganization of the economy is possible now with this communication technology, unlike in the life of Marx, you can have direct links worker to worker on a global level. So the
like we are now. Yeah.
Like we are now.
I mean, this is a big, you could say, when we got the internet, when we got this sort of communication, the social media and everything, you could say, oh, well, it's all going to be under control of the governments, the capitalists. They'll be looking at every minute. They can look at what we're doing now. They've got our phone. They can listen to our phone calls and so on. Frankly, I would tell the MI5, it's not much point listening to mine because it's usually about where's my dinner. But if that it's a repressive situation. But as you correctly say, Steve, it is also the other side of the coin is a tremendous possibility for worldwide communication and so on. We've seen that struggles are often taking place through social media activity, in flash protests and so on, in discussions like this. I mean, we can't discuss the world economy before so easily like we can now on this Zoom, even 20 years ago when we had to sit down and perhaps do it by email or maybe a telephone call or something like that, or going further back, everything had to be written and posted. So we've made it's a dramatic improvement to enable us to organize the situation worldwide. And you could say that when you've had a socialist government comes to power in any particular country, if now it's got the means of communication to the rest of us to really help their struggle and to spread that struggle. So there's always two sides to the coin for technology, and communication is in this case, I think, a big boost for Labour if we can. And it has dangers, as we know, but it is a big boost for Labour.
And your journal, your blog, you have readers all over the world. What has been your experience as far as this international discussion on the capitalist economy and the working class and socialism?
Yeah, I think I don't know whether the viewers agree, but I've got about 15,000 people follow my blog. Now, compared to Elon Musk, that's tiny. But there are 15,000 socialists out there across the world, in every country in the world. My blog has got at least one person in every country in the world who follows my blog. So, and I'm just one person. That shows the power that we could do with the social media. But the issues that dominate, I think, the minds of my blog readers, which comes up in the comments and sometimes, are probably threefold. One is inequality, the shocking inequality which exists in the world, not just the poverty, but the inequality within countries, which we know in the case of the States, but also in Europe and elsewhere. And that really angers and riles people. And it's getting worse, as we know. When you've just got, as I think Bernie Sanders said the other day, 3 people in the US own as much in wealth as 50% of the population. What sort of a situation is that? How can that be allowed to happen? And how can it be allowed to continue? That's one. The other one is the climate, of course. I mean, it's a big thing. We've this new challenge to capitalism. Capitalism's created this nasty global warming, which is uncontrollable, leading to major climate change, getting worse year by year. And we're having a COP29 conference again on how to deal with climate. Nothing will come out of this significantly to change that picture. And this is a major issue for everybody. The end of not just of millions of people losing their livelihoods or even their lives in areas where they get flooded and so on, but also nature being destroyed. This is a new phenomenon of the 21st century. And that's an issue that really dominates the minds of many people who read my blog and, of course, elsewhere. And then perhaps I think one that's increasingly worrying people is war. That we are now seeing, we've always had endless wars under capitalism, but usually been small ones of different sizes, which the Americans have usually dealt with. They lost in Vietnam, and now they increasingly lose their wars. They had to leave Afghanistan and so on. And you might say they won Iraq, but Iraq is just a mess. So they haven't really solved anything. They haven't established control of Iraq. So wars are being lost by the US imperialism and elsewhere. And we've had other wars. Now we have Ukraine, which looks like an endless nightmare of a war. And the possibility, need I say anything about the situation in Gaza, but the horrendous situation that exists in Gaza, which is uncontrollable. This really worries a lot of my readers, that we're going to get more wars and more dangerous wars. And I think that's the issue in this decade. Will we end up with a major war against a major power like China? Because the Americans wish to dominate the world and maintain their position. So I think those are the 3 biggest issues in the minds of people who read my blog.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Michael Roberts. He has a blog about the history of capitalism, industrial revolution, AI, the development of China, the development of inflation, and the rise of fascism internationally. So thanks for joining us on this show.
Thank you, Steve.
Very good.